didn't choose, and a legacy he didn't ask for. The hat, something he wore more out of habit than conviction, had become a lightning rod. Not just for others but for him too. He thought about what the hat meant to him. Growing up, it had been a symbol of family pride, a way to stand by his father even when the world seemed determined to tear him down. But as he got older, he began to question what it represented to others. Was it a declaration of loyalty? A statement of defiance? Or something more divisive than he had ever intended? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. His security detail, a man named Travis who'd been with him for years, poked his head in. "There's someone here to see you," he said. "Says his name is Jameson. He's the guy everyone's talking about at the protests." Barron hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to meet anyone right now, let alone someone tied to the chaos outside. But curiosity won out. "Let him in," he said. Jameson entered. His presence as unassuming as it was commanding. Up close, Barron could see the weathered lines on his face, the kind that came from years of experience and hard-earned wisdom. He carried a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to be announced. "I figured you'd be watching," Jameson said, gesturing toward the muted TV. "Thought I'd come by and save you the trouble of wondering." Barron raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Just someone who's seen enough to know when things are spiraling out of control," Jameson replied, taking a seat across from him. "You probably think this is all about a hat. But it's not, is it?" Barron didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. "People out there are angry," Jameson continued. "Some because they think you're standing for something they hate. Others because they think you're being treated unfairly. But neither side is really listening to each other. Or to you." Barron leaned back, folding his arms. "What do you want me to do? Go out there and give a speech? That'll just make it worse." Jameson shook his head. "No speeches, no grandstanding. Just honesty. Tell them what you told yourself when you put that hat on today. Because right now, they're not fighting over you. They're fighting over what they think you represent." Barron frowned, mulling over Jameson's words. He wasn't used to people speaking to him so plainly, without deference or judgment. It was refreshing and unsettling. "I'm not even sure what I represent anymore," he admitted quietly. "To myself or anyone else." Jameson nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Then maybe it's time to figure that out. Not for them, for you." Barron sat in silence as Jameson stood to leave. "I'll be outside if you decide to take that first step," he said, his tone gentle but firm. And with that, he was gone. Barron stared at the closed door, his mind racing. For the first time in a long while he felt the faint stirrings of clarity. Maybe this wasn't about the hat, or even the hotel. Maybe it was about taking control of his own narrative. As the noise outside grew louder, Barron faced a choice. Retreat into the shadows or step into the light and make his voice heard. The world was waiting. The crowd outside the Grand Crest Hotel had swelled to a breaking point. Protesters on both sides of the debate were now separated by a thin line of police officers, their voices growing louder with every passing minute. Barron watched from a distance as Jameson stepped between the groups, his hands raised, signaling for calm. The cameras zoomed in on him, the older man who had somehow managed to capture everyone's attention. His voice, though steady, carried enough authority to silence the crowd momentarily. "Listen up," Jameson began, his tone measured but firm. "You're all here because of a disagreement about a hat, right? But let's get real. This isn't just about a piece of fabric. It's about what it represents to each of you. And that's where the problem starts." Barron leaned closer to the screen, his curiosity piqued. Jameson's words weren't rehearsed or overly polished. They felt raw, authentic, as if he were speaking from experience. "You're shouting at each other like you're enemies," Jameson continued. "But has anyone actually tried to listen? To ask why that hat makes some of you proud and others angry? Because until you do, all you're doing is adding fuel to a fire that helps no one." The crowd murmured, their collective energy shifting. Some lowered their signs. Others exchanged hesitant glances. Jameson took a deep breath and scanned the faces before him. "I'm not here to take sides," he said. "I'm here to remind you that there's a person at the center of all this. A young man who didn't ask for this circus. Maybe instead of fighting about what he represents, you should let him tell you himself. The tension in the air was palpable. The protesters were no longer shouting, but the weight of their unspoken words hung heavy. Jameson turned to the cameras, his gaze direct and unflinching. "Barron Trump, if you're watching this, the floor is yours," he said. "We're ready to listen." Barron's breath hitched. The invitation was unexpected, and the pressure felt immense. He glanced at Travis, his security detail, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "Think you're ready for this?" Travis asked. Barron hesitated, his mind racing. For years he'd avoided the spotlight, letting others speak for him. But now he had a chance to reclaim his voice, to set the record straight. Not just for the world, but for himself. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think it's time I tried." Travis handed him a jacket, and Barron slid it on, his movements slow and deliberate. As he stepped outside, the cool air hit his face, grounding him in the moment. The reporters, the protesters, and the police all turned toward him, their eyes wide with anticipation. Jameson met him halfway, his expression calm and reassuring. "Take your time," he whispered. "Speak from the heart." Barron swallowed hard and approached the crowd. The cameras zoomed in, the microphones angled toward him, and the noise fell to a deafening silence. With the world watching, Barron prepared to deliver the words that would define this moment. Not for others, but for himself. Barron stood in the spotlight, the weight of countless eyes on him. The crowd, once divided and restless, now waited in an almost eerie silence. The only sound was the occasional rustle of protest signs and the faint hum of distant traffic. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. For years the world had spoken about him as if he were a symbol, a placeholder for larger debates. But standing there, he felt something shift. He wasn't just a name or an image anymore. He was a person with his own story to tell. "I didn't plan for any of this," Barron began, his voice steady but soft. "When I booked a room at the Grand Crest, I just wanted a quiet weekend. I didn't think my hat would be an issue. But I guess it was never really about the hat, was it?" He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical, but all were listening. "For some of you, this hat represents something you believe in, something you're proud of. For others, it's a reminder of things you've experienced or things you're afraid of. And honestly, I get it. Symbols have power. They mean different things to different people." The crowd murmured in agreement, a mix of nods and folded arms. Barron continued, his tone growing firmer. "But here's the thing. I didn't put this hat on to make a statement today. I put it on because it's part of who I am, part of my history. That doesn't mean I agree with everything it stands for to everyone else. It just means it's a piece of my life, and I shouldn't have to explain that every time I walk into a room." The tension in the air began to thaw, replaced by a sense of curiosity. People leaned in, eager to hear more. "What happened at the hotel wasn't just about me," Barron said. "It was about how we see each other, how quick we are to judge someone based on a single thing. A hat, a name, a background. But we're all more than that, aren't we?" The protesters on both sides exchanged glances, some nodding slowly. Jameson, standing off to the side, gave Barron a subtle look of approval. "I'm not here to change your minds about politics or policies," Barron said. "I'm here to ask you to think about the person standing in front of you, not just the symbol you think they represent. Because if we can't do that, then what are we even fighting for?" A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first but growing louder. Barron glanced at the reporters, their cameras trained on him, capturing every word. "I'll leave you with this," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have to agree on everything to respect each other. But if we keep letting symbols divide us, we're going to lose sight of what really matters, the people behind them." With that, Barron stepped back, letting the applause wash over him. Jameson approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, kid," he said quietly. The crowd began to disperse, the tension replaced by a hum of thoughtful conversation. Protesters lowered their signs, some even engaging in discussions with those they'd stood against moments before. The media captured the transformation, their headlines now shifting focus. Barron Trump's speech sparks unlikely dialogue at protest. As Barron walked away from the scene, he felt lighter, freer. He hadn't solved all the world's problems, but he'd taken a step toward understanding his own place in it. And maybe, just maybe, he'd helped others do the same. But the real victory wasn't in the speech. It was in the quiet moments that followed, as strangers began to see each other not as enemies, but as people. As Barron stepped into the car waiting to take him back to his Airbnb, he caught a final glimpse of the crowd. What had started as a clash of opinions had softened into something far more meaningful. Conversations. Protesters who had shouted past one another were now talking, sharing their perspectives. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Sitting in the back seat, Barron reflected on what had just happened. The experience had pushed him out of his comfort zone, forcing him to confront the complexities of identity, perception, and communication. The hat had been a catalyst, but the real story wasn't about the symbol. It was about the people, their stories, and their willingness to listen. As the car pulled away, Jameson's words echoed in his mind. It's not about changing minds, it's about opening hearts. For everyone involved, Barron, the protesters, the hotel staff, this was a moment of growth. A reminder that behind every headline, there's a human story worth hearing. Perhaps the world needed less judgment and more understanding, less division and more connection. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking content that dives into the human stories behind the headlines. Let us know in the comments. What do you think about the power of symbols in our lives, and how can we bridge the divides they sometimes create? Your voice matters. Share your thoughts and join the conversation. What happens when Barron Trump's MAGA hat sparks a hotel scandal that explodes into a national debate? The fallout is nothing you'd expect. And it all hinges on one unexpected moment of truth. Barron Trump hadn't planned on making waves that weekend. For once, he wanted to disappear into anonymity. The pressures of being in the spotlight, constantly judged for every move he made, had worn him down. He booked a suite at the prestigious Grand Crest Hotel in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, known for its sweeping mountain views and air of exclusivity. It was the kind of place where discretion was a selling point, and privacy was guaranteed. As his car rolled up the cobblestone driveway, Barron took a deep breath. For the first time in months, he felt like he might get a chance to be just another young man enjoying a weekend away. Wearing a plain hoodie over his favorite red MAGA hat, he stepped into the gleaming marble lobby. The atmosphere inside was as he expected, quiet, refined, and understated. A few guests glanced his way, but no one stared. To them, he was just another customer, or so he thought. Approaching the front desk, Barron adjusted his hat and placed his ID and credit card on the counter. The receptionist, a man in his early 30s with an impeccably polished demeanor, greeted him warmly, at first. But his expression shifted the moment his eyes landed on the hat. "I'm sorry, Mr. Trump," the receptionist said, his tone cautious. "Our management has a strict policy against overtly political attire. I'm afraid we cannot check you in unless you remove your cap." Barron froze, caught off guard. He'd stayed at countless hotels, worn this very hat in more contentious places, and had never faced anything like this. He tilted his head, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Are you saying I can't stay here because of my hat?" The receptionist glanced around as if looking for backup. "It's not personal. It's just a policy we have in place to maintain a neutral environment for all our guests." Barron's face remained impassive, but inside a storm was brewing. "I've already booked a suite," he replied evenly. "You've taken my money. Now you're telling me my hat is a problem?" The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. Guests nearby had started to notice the exchange. Some whispered to each other, their curiosity piqued. Barron could feel the weight of their stares, but he refused to back down. "It's not about the money," the receptionist said. "We'll issue a full refund if needed, but the policy stands." For a moment, Barron considered taking off the hat, if only to avoid the hassle. But something about the situation struck a nerve. Was this really about the hat? Or was it about who he was, and who his family was? He crossed his arms and stood his ground. "Then I guess I'm not leaving." The tension in the lobby thickened. Staff members began to murmur among themselves, and a manager appeared, her expression both apologetic and resolute. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice measured, "we'd like to avoid a scene. If you'd prefer, we can make arrangements at another hotel for you." Barron's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He picked up his ID and credit card and turned on his heel. As he walked toward the doors, he could hear the hushed conversations swelling behind him. By the time he reached the car, his phone was already buzzing. Someone had recorded the entire interaction. Little did he know this was only the beginning of a firestorm. By the time Barron's car pulled away from the Grand Crest Hotel, the video was already online. A bystander in the lobby, quick to recognize him, had uploaded a short clip titled, "Barron Trump denied stay over MAGA hat at luxury hotel." Within minutes it began to spread like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with debates, outrage, and ridicule. Sitting in the back seat, Barron stared at his phone, watching the flood of notifications and mentions. The comments were a mix of sympathy, anger, and scorn. "Good for the hotel. MAGA hats don't belong in classy places. Discrimination, plain and simple. Doesn't matter who you are. He's just a kid trying to live his life. Leave him alone." Barron scrolled aimlessly, his face unreadable. But inside, a whirlwind of emotions churned. Part of him wanted to ignore it all, but another part felt the sting of humiliation. For years he'd tried to carve out an identity separate from the shadow of his family. Now, it seemed impossible. This wasn't just about him. It was about the name he carried, the hat he wore, and the assumptions that came with both. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, the staff was in damage control mode. The manager, still shaken from the encounter, gathered her team in the back office. "We need a statement, and we need it now," she said, her tone sharp. This could spiral out of control, but it already had. The Grand Crest's social media pages were flooded with angry messages. Longtime patrons threatened boycotts, while others praised the hotel for taking a stand. News outlets picked up the story, each one adding its own spin. Was this an act of principled neutrality or blatant discrimination? The narrative depended on who was telling it. As the hours passed, reporters began arriving at the hotel, cameras in hand. Guests were interviewed at the entrance, their opinions as polarized as the online discourse. "I think the policy makes sense," said a man in a tailored suit. "Politics don't belong here." "But denying service over a hat?" countered a woman holding her luggage. "That's absurd." Barron's phone rang. His mother. He hesitated before answering. "I saw the video," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied flatly, though his tone betrayed his frustration. "It's not like this is the first time something like this has happened." His mother paused. "Do you want me to handle it?" "No," Barron said firmly. "I'll deal with it." For the first time he realized that this wasn't just about the hotel or even the hat. It was about standing up for himself, on his own terms. He hung up the phone and stared out the window as the car sped down the highway. Back at the Grand Crest, the chaos only intensified. The video's reach had grown exponentially, and now, celebrities and politicians were chiming in. Each new comment stoked the flames further, pushing the story into a full-blown media circus. As night fell, the hotel lobby was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, guests complaining about the disruption. The once serene Grand Crest had become a battleground of opinions and ideals. And yet, amidst the frenzy, Barron's silence was deafening. But as tensions rose, one question loomed: how far would this go before someone stepped in to make it right? By morning, the story had reached every corner of the internet and beyond. News anchors debated it on morning shows. Hashtags like #MAGAHotelGate and #Barron Trump trended on social media, and opinion pieces flooded major publications. Some called it a brave stand against divisive symbols. Others labeled it an outrageous act of discrimination. The Grand Crest Hotel's phone lines were overwhelmed, with calls coming in from both supporters and detractors. Barron, meanwhile, found himself holed up in a modest Airbnb on the outskirts of the town. He'd chosen the location precisely for its lack of luxury, somewhere he could lay low and avoid prying eyes. But privacy was hard to come by when the world had you under a microscope. A news van parked outside the property, the crew waiting like vultures for a statement. Sitting at the kitchen table, Barron scrolled through his phone. Every major outlet had covered the story, each with its own slant. Headlines ranged from, "Barron Trump denied hotel stay in Wyoming," to, "Should politics stay out of hospitality?" The weight of the situation was finally sinking in. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It was a cultural flashpoint. People were arguing about him, using his name to validate their own beliefs. He wasn't sure what stung more, the rejection at the hotel or the way strangers felt entitled to define him. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a direct message request on Instagram. Curious, he opened it to find a message from a woman named Monica Alvarez, a journalist for a well-known independent media outlet. "Hi Barron, I'd like to hear your side of the story. I think people deserve to know how you're feeling about all this. Let me know if you're interested in talking." Barron stared at the message. He'd avoided speaking publicly about the incident so far, not wanting to add fuel to the fire. But Monica's tone felt different, less accusatory, more curious. For a brief moment he considered responding, but then he thought better of it. Instead, he closed the app and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. At the Grand Crest, things were reaching a boiling point. The hotel's management team huddled in a conference room, exhausted from the relentless backlash. Their carefully worded statement, emphasizing their commitment to neutrality and guest comfort, had backfired spectacularly, with critics calling it a non-apology. "Should we just let him come back?" one staff member asked, exasperated. "And what happens when other guests complain?" countered another. "We'll look weak. The policy is the policy." "But this isn't just about policy anymore," the manager said, rubbing her temples. "This is about the hotel's reputation. If we don't handle this correctly, we're finished." Outside, protesters had begun gathering. Some waved signs supporting Barron, demanding justice for what they saw as blatant discrimination. Others applauded the hotel's decision, arguing that political symbols of any kind had no place in a neutral setting. The divide was palpable, and tempers were running high. Barron watched live footage of the protests on his phone, his expression unreadable. He couldn't help but wonder how a simple weekend getaway had turned into this spectacle. Deep down, though, he knew it wasn't about the hat. It was about what it represented, both to him and to everyone else. And yet, amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. An older man in a well-worn leather jacket approached the protesters on both sides, speaking calmly and quietly. Though he was hard to hear over the noise, his presence was striking, his demeanor composed. People began to listen. Barron had no idea who the man was, but he felt an inexplicable sense that this stranger might be the key to unraveling the mess. As the protests intensified, the mysterious figure at the center of the crowd began to shift the tone, but no one was prepared for what he would say next. Barron sat by the window of his Airbnb, watching the news coverage of the protests outside the Grand Crest Hotel. The crowd had doubled in size since morning, and the camera occasionally panned to the older man in the leather jacket, who appeared to be mediating between the opposing sides. His voice was soft yet commanding, his gestures deliberate. Barron leaned forward, intrigued. For the first time in days, Barron allowed himself a moment to think. Not about the headlines, the protests, or the relentless opinions being hurled in his direction, but about himself. His life had always been under scrutiny, shaped by expectations he didn't choose.